Ek gesels vanoggend met Emeritus professor Brian van Wilgen van die Sentrum vir Indringerbiologie aan die Universiteit Stellenbosch. Now, Prof, welcome to Grootplaas.
Thank you.
It's really such a pleasure, and it's such a big topic to talk about. Let's start at the beginning. This study that you guys undertook, what did the study entail, and why was the study done in the first place?
Well, the government in 1995 started a program called Working for Water. It was a job creation program that had the dual aims of clearing invasive alien plants out of the country and also creating jobs in areas where jobs are needed, which is just about everywhere. So one needs to assess these things from time to time, and there is the law in this country requires what they call a status report every 3 years.
Yes.
But sometimes you have to wait a little bit longer before you can measure progress. So we've waited 20 years now, and we've tried to assess how well they are doing and what the challenges are that they're facing.
When it comes to, I'm sure that it took some time, and for people who don't always realize the effort that goes into an enormous study like this, how did the process go? What did you take into account when doing a study like this?
Well, we've known from long ago already, 50 years ago and more, that we're heading for a problem with invasive alien plants. So, you know, a lot of experimentation and measurement was done before the Working for Water program existed. But we've now got a lot of information on the amount of money that's been spent, where it's been spent, which species it's been spent on. And, you know, we can assess that and also try to assess how well we're doing against the size of the problem.
Yes. What are some of the examples of problematic plant species in South Africa? And I'm sure there are quite a few. If you can explain to us maybe in a language that we can understand.
Well, alien plants are plants that are not indigenous to South Africa. They've been brought here either on purpose or by accident. And it's not just plants, it's animals as well. So we've got about 2,000 alien species that have naturalized in the country, and about a quarter of them have become invasive. So what happens is when they're brought here, you know, in their original range, they've got all sorts of checks and balances on them, insects and diseases that keep them in check. And suddenly they are free of this. And they can start spreading over the landscape. They crowd everything else out, and they have a lot of negative impacts.
And some examples of plants that we might know?
Well, here where I live in the Cape, my pet hate is pine trees because they spread all over the mountains. You know, if you drive along the garden route between Knysna and Plettenberg Bay and Quebec, you'll just see the mountains are entirely covered in pine trees. In the Northern Cape, we've got what they call mesquite. It's a prosopis tree that was introduced again by the government in the 1950s to provide fodder for cattle and livestock. But these things have become invasive, and they're entirely taking over the Northern Cape, you know, crowding out any good grazing and so on. There are many other examples.
So obviously, the main goal with a study like this is more needs to be done. And we've seen that a lot of money is being spent, but still it's not enough. If you can elaborate on that a little bit for me.
Well, let me say, first of all, that we're very lucky that the government is spending the amount of money that they are spending. It's about 300 million rand a year. You know, other countries are spending hardly anything. But when we look at the size of the problem, the money is not enough. You know, we're getting to about 14% of the estimated invaded area. And if you look at it where the program is active, they're making some progress. You know, the invasions are becoming less dense and less problematic. But if you look at it at a national scale over the entire country, then the invasions are still growing.
When it comes to somebody like a normal person on the street, and you tell them about a concept like alien plants, how does alien plants affect our everyday lives? I mean, what's the impact you see in your career and your profession?
Well, quite often people don't see the impact directly, or they don't make the connection. But for example, I'll come back to the pine trees here in the Western Cape. They're invading the mountain catchment areas, and they use a whole lot more water than the indigenous fynbos vegetation. So what happens is, where you used to get maybe 600 millimeters of stream flow per annum out of a stream, you're now getting only 200 millimeters. So the dams are more likely to run dry in droughts than they would have been, if the alien plants weren't there. And, we could have avoided, or we could have postponed what they call day zero in Cape Town by 2 weeks if it had not been for invasive alien plants. So that's just one example of the problems. If you look in, at some of these plants take over a lot of our rangelands where we're grazing with cattle and sheep and so on, and they can be poisonous. They can take away the palatable grasses and replace them. And so the productivity of our rangelands goes down.
Yes.
And then if you look at South Africa as a biodiverse country, we've got more than our fair share of indigenous plants and animals that occur nowhere else on Earth. And these things are being squeezed out. And that has impacts not only on the ecosystems, but also on things like tourism.
Prof, I think I just quickly want to, before we go further, is what do you focus on in your industry, in your profession? I mean, what's your main focus?
Well, I'm an applied ecologist, and I try to use scientific understanding to help better manage our ecosystems. But then, one gets specialized fields. So, I don't work in the sea, for example. I'm a terrestrial ecologist, and my research is focused on both fire ecology and management, and the management of invasive species.
When you guys did this study now, obviously you, in a perfect ideal world, we would want that study to be used as a solution. So what are the next steps after your study?
Well, as I said, there's never going to be enough money for us to tackle everything everywhere. And so the first thing that we really have to do is decide on where our priorities are.
Yes.
Which areas do we want to save from these invasive species, and which areas can we afford to sacrifice in order to use the money that we've got more effectively? That's called triage. You decide where to spend your money and you forget about the rest. It's unfortunately what we have to do.
Yes.
So my first piece of advice would be, determine what the priorities are, where we can actually make our best impact, and refocus all of our efforts on those priority areas.
What would you say to a person asking the question, is it worth spending this kind of money on a problem like this?
Well, I would say, yes, it is. We've done some economic studies where we looked at the impacts that these invasive species have on water resources, on rangeland productivity, on human health, on fire impacts, all of these things. And we calculated the value of that damage. And we compared it to the cost of control. And what comes out of that is actually very, very surprising. For every rand that you spend on controlling these things, you save up to 100 or more rands in damage. So even if we can only work on a few areas, it would be extremely worthwhile to do that.
In your professional opinion, where do you think should be some of the main focus points?
Well, there are a number. I would say we should start with the mountain catchment areas, which deliver a lot of water. We're a water-scarce country, and we need to look after our water resources. We should focus on protected areas, national parks and nature reserves. At least try to keep those clear of invasive species. And then some of the other important areas would be the very productive rangelands, which support our livestock industry. and also biodiversity hotspots, areas where there's a particular concentration of endangered species, for example.
When it comes to these plants, obviously, like you've said, it's quite a big problem. They are spread quite freely across the country. How would one start to combat that? How does that process work?
Well, there's a few things you can do. There's mechanical control. You can actually cut them down and uproot them and so on. There's chemical control where you can use herbicides, either spray the herbicides or apply them to cut stumps to stop the plants from sprouting and so on. Mm. But the really promising method is biological control, where you bring in those insects and pathogens that kept them in check in their home range, and you bring them here and you let them do the work for you. You've got to be careful that you don't introduce a pest that's going to attack other things. So there's a lot of testing that goes into to make these things safe. Mm. But when you can find a biological control agent, it really works. Mm. You know, people forget how big the problem was when the problem disappears. It's like COVID,
it's we've forgotten
about it anymore. But in the 1920s and 1930s, large parts of the Karoo were completely covered in invasive cactuses. Mm. And people had to give up farming. And they brought in some biological control agents, and the problem is now gone. Mm. You can't see it anymore. Mm. So people have forgotten that.
It's very true what you're saying. Any final thoughts from your side?
Yes, like I say, I don't think we have enough money. And what we're also going to have to do is to try and raise money from the private sector and also from international donors and funding to help to tackle this problem. Mm. And what's very encouraging is that's starting to happen. There's a Cape Town Water Fund now, which is funded by a lot of foreign money and by the private sponsors. Mm.
I always like to ask, if somebody really feels passionate about this, and they want to get involved, where do they knock on the door?
Well, again, here where I live in the Western Cape, people are very aware of the problem, and a lot of these little towns around here have got what they call hack groups. Yeah. People volunteer to go out on a Saturday or a weekday even and join groups of people just clearing alien plants around their houses and so on. I think that's a very useful thing to do.
It's absolutely a good start. Prof, thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful day. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.